It's the first week in October here in the UK, and although it's a nice warmish sunny day at the moment, it's time now to be thinking about your plan for what you're going to do with your dahlia tubers once the frosty weather is due. And we're going to look today at the options and some of the things you might want to think about. So the first question you will want to answer is whether you want to leave the tubers in the ground over winter, or whether you are planning to dig them up. And things that you should consider here are what the tuber can cope with. So tubers, dahlia tubers will not cope with being frozen. So depending on whereabouts in the world you are, if it's a fairly warm climate, then you can certainly leave your dahlia tubers in the ground as far as freeze is concerned. But they also can't cope with wet soil. So if the tubers are in an area which will become waterlogged, then you really cannot leave them in the ground, they will rot. So with those two considerations, first question is, shall you dig up your tubers and then store them over winter, or are you going to leave them in the ground? So let's look first at leaving them in the ground. If you're doing this, then that's fine, that's the least troublesome option. I've already said you can't allow them to freeze, and neither can you allow them to sit in a waterlogged or very damp soil, because they will not last through the winter that way. But it's perfectly okay to leave them in the ground, and they will simply sprout as the weather warms up next year, and you will have roughly the same dahlia crop that you had the previous year. Now, if you are leaving them in the ground, then you do have to consider the possibility of frost, there is an option, and that is that you can mulch very deeply with something that will protect the soil from freezing, from the worst of freezing. So that can be either an awful lot of compost or organic matter, or more safely something which will limit the heat loss rather better than just damp compost, and that could be straw. Non-organic matter, people have used rubber from old tyres, they've used mattresses, they've used plastic sheeting. All of these are the purpose is to trap air within the structure so that the freezing temperatures can't penetrate that insulated area, so that your tubers, although the outside may freeze over, your tubers will be protected from frost. So what you'd usually do is leave your tuber in the ground. You would mulch with something to protect the surface of the ground, and also to apply some organic matter and fertilise if that's the way you're doing things. And then you wait until the shoots appear next year. So you've decided to leave your tubers in the ground, and the price you'll pay for that is you are not going to be increasing your stock this year, because you have a single tuber clump originally, and you're leaving it in the ground. So although there may be more tubers, well, there will be more tubers because tubers tend to increase in the ground, there will be no more flowers than last year, because you will be limiting the number of shoots to 6 or 7 anyway. And on the plus side, it's less work. You don't have to dig your tubers up, you don't have to store them in a particular way, and we'll talk about that later. And you leave them in the ground to put up shoots next year once the weather warms up. Another disadvantage of doing that is that you do have to wait for the weather to warm up to get your dahlias started again, whereas if you're lifting them and you have an option then of starting the dahlias under heat or at least protection, so that the shoots will come earlier and you'll get flowers earlier. The option which is most likely to give you flowers as early as possible are to keep the dahlia clump, to dig it out and store it over winter, and then plant it up in a pot fairly early on. So in the UK that would be February time, and warm the pot up, and then you've got your dahlia off and working in February. You have to protect it from frost then as it develops, and as soon as you are in the frost-free period in your country, then you would plant it in the ground. You've already got a nice large plant then with lots of productive shoots, so that they would start to produce flowers as early on as possible. So to increase your stock, you would want to dig your tuber out and divide it, or produce single dahlia tubers, or else you can take cuttings and root those. And if you are going to divide them into two or three clumps, or else divide them into single dahlia tubers, then this is a method of increasing your stock of dahlias for next year. So if you are wanting to increase your stock, get more plants, then you would want to lift the tuber out and do one of those options, one of those two options. And that's it for this video. I will be doing another one fairly soon once I do get to the stage of digging these tubers out, which is what I'll certainly do, is dig the tubers out, maybe divide some into singles and store them in cling film as we did last year, or maybe I will store them as tuber clumps with a view to partial division next spring. And I'll show you how we do that and how we do our best to protect the tubers from rotting or drying out. So many thanks indeed for listening in again, and I hope to see you again pretty soon. Bye for now.